The sky above the Galactic Academy burned with the colors of two suns sinking low, casting long shadows across the open training fields. The ground was dry and cracked, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of alien voices waiting for orders. Every cadet stood in formation, claws, scales, fur, and strange limbs trembling with nervous energy. The instructors towered before them, armored in black, their voices carrying through the air like rolling thunder. Tonight was the test, the survival trial, the moment every student both feared and waited for. They had been told many times, shelter is life. Without shelter you are nothing. Without shelter you are prey. And tonight they would learn that lesson with their own bodies and their own hands. No machines, no weapons, only their minds, their strength, and whatever the strange wild land could give them. One instructor raised a heavy arm, a glowing scar running down its skin, and spoke with a voice sharp as steel. You will be taken to the trial ground. You will build a shelter before the night ends. When the suns rise again, we will see who is strong enough to survive. You will find rain. You will find storm. You will find fear. And only those who endure will pass. The weak will fail. The lazy will suffer. And the unprepared will be forgotten. The aliens in the line whispered, their voices low and filled with doubt. Some had built shelters before, thin huts of leaves or quick walls of mud. Others had only studied diagrams and hoped the night would be kind. But their eyes all turned to one figure standing calm among them. The human, the only human in the academy. The one they called the soft one, the fragile one, the weak one. The human did not shift or whisper. His gaze was steady. His arms rested at his sides, and his expression was calm, as if the coming storm was already known to him, as if he had seen it before. Many of the cadets sneered quietly. A few laughed. One with sharp teeth leaned close to another and hissed, "He will not last an hour. He will cry for help before the night ends." Another added, "Humans break easily. They are not made for real survival. They cling to machines. They hide behind walls. They cannot stand on their own." But the instructors gave no time for argument. A sharp signal rang out, and the ground shuddered as transport carriers arrived. The students were herded inside, hearts beating with dread and excitement. The carriers lifted into the sky, roaring engines drowning out their voices, and soon they were carried across the wide desert toward the dark green line of a forest far away. The trial ground, a place where storms never rested and creatures of shadow hunted without sound. The humans sat among them, silent, while others whispered plans and strategies. One reptilian cadet hissed that he would weave vines into a dome. Another said she would dig into the ground like her ancestors. But when they asked the human what he planned, he only said quietly, "I will build what I need." His words were simple, yet the way he spoke made some fall silent, though most laughed louder, thinking him arrogant, foolish, or both. At last the carriers landed with a heavy thud. The doors opened, and a blast of wild air filled the chamber, heavy with the smell of wet earth and burning ozone. The cadets stepped out, their eyes wide as they saw the storm clouds already building above the treeline. Flashes of lightning split the horizon. Thunder rolled like the march of giant beasts. The forest whispered with unseen movement, as if alive and waiting for them to enter. The instructors spread their arms and shouted, "You have until the suns rise. Build your shelter, survive the night, and prove you are worthy." Then they stepped back, leaving the cadets alone in the open. No guidance, no tools, only the task. The cadets scattered quickly, some running into the trees to gather branches, others rushing to the riverbank for reeds and vines, all of them racing against time, fear quickening their movements, voices sharp with panic. The human did not run. He walked slowly across the ground, eyes scanning the land. He bent down to pick up stones. He tapped them against each other, listening to the sound. He pressed his hand into the soil, testing its weight and moisture. Then he rose and walked toward the heavier trees, calm as if the storm meant nothing to him, calm as if he had walked this land before, while the others broke into frantic motion around him. The cadets saw him carrying heavy logs one after another, dragging them across the field, his body moving with steady rhythm. No hesitation, no panic, only work. They mocked him loudly, shouting that he was wasting time, that logs were too heavy, that his arms would give out before midnight. But he ignored them, his eyes focused, his breathing steady. The sound of wood against earth filling the quiet between thunderclaps. Above them the sky darkened, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops. The storm had arrived early. It was stronger than they had feared. Lightning struck the edge of the forest, sending up sparks and smoke. The cadets cried out, rushing to lash together leaves and vines before their shelters collapsed, panic growing with every passing breath. But still the human worked, moving logs, gathering stones, digging into the ground with his bare hands, the rain washing over him as if it was nothing. The instructors watched from their distant platform, recording every move, and one leaned to another and muttered, "Watch the human. Something about the way he moves is different. Something about his silence is not weakness, but intent." The night was only beginning, but already the whisper spread. Perhaps the human was not as weak as they had thought. Perhaps he was building something more than a shelter. Perhaps he was building something they could not yet imagine. The storm grew heavier as the cadets rushed across the trial ground. Rain fell in great sheets of silver water. Thunder cracked above like the anger of the sky. Every alien mind screamed that time was short, that shelter was the only thing between life and ruin. And yet in the middle of all this frenzy the human moved with strange calm, his steps slow but sure, his arms carrying logs one after another, his hands black with mud, his eyes steady as if he could already see the end of the night. Before it had even begun, the reptilian cadet who had promised to weave vines hissed curses as the wet strand slipped through his claws. Every knot came loose, every wall fell apart. He snapped his teeth and shouted to the others, "Look at him. The human wastes time. He thinks he is strong, but when the storm reaches its heart, he will be the first to fall." His voice was sharp and cruel, yet deep inside there was a quiet fear, for his own shelter was nothing but a pile of broken branches leaning against each other, weak as dry straw against the storm. Another cadet, furred and tall with eyes like pale moons, dug with frantic claws into the earth, hoping to hide inside the ground. But the soil was heavy with water. The hole filled quickly. Mud clung to her fur and dragged her down. She growled and spat, blaming the human even as she failed, saying if the instructors had not brought a soft creature here, then all of them would have been given fairer ground. Her anger was loud, but her shelter was still nothing, only a pit of water and despair. In the distance the human lifted his logs into a frame. He leaned them together and bound them with vines, not thin knots like the reptilian cadet, but thick cords twisted strong. He hammered stones into the ground to anchor the structure. Each strike echoed against the rain like a drumbeat of purpose. Some cadets laughed louder at the sight, pointing with claws and tails, saying he builds a palace for ghosts. He builds a monument to failure. No one can finish such a task in one night. But their laughter shook with doubt, for his frame already looked stronger than the flimsy shelters they had rushed to build. The instructors stood on their high platform, cloaked against the storm, their eyes cold as they watched. They spoke to one another in voices hidden by the thunder, noting how the cadets wasted energy, noting how panic ruled them. But their words grew slower when they pointed to the human. One instructor muttered the humans were strange, that they wasted effort on tasks no one else would dare. Another said perhaps he is foolish, perhaps he does not understand the rules. Yet a third voice whispered that perhaps he does understand, perhaps more than the others. The night deepened, lightning split the sky. The shelters of the cadets bent and tore. The leaves soaked through. The mud walls crumbled. The vines snapped like weak strings. Cries of anger and despair filled the storm. One cadet shouted at another, pushing him aside, clawing at the same tree trunk. Their fear made them fight each other more than the storm. Yet still they looked again and again toward the human, for he did not stumble. He did not curse. He only worked with steady rhythm, carrying stones to line the ground, shaping mud into walls, raising logs into something taller and stronger than a simple hut. Whispers began among the cadets, sharp whispers carried by the storm. One said the human must know some secret. Another said perhaps humans have hidden tools. Perhaps they cheat. Perhaps they lie. Suspicion grew like weeds in the dark, and anger followed. The reptilian cadet hissed that they should tear down his work before it gave him unfair advantage. But none dared approach, for the sight of him swinging heavy wood through the rain with calm strength made them hesitate. And in their hesitation the structure grew larger still. At the edge of the forest, hidden eyes watched Small creatures with glowing markings crept closer, drawn by the strange noise of stone against stone, by the light of sparks when flint struck together in the human's hands. The cadets gasped when they saw it. Fire, real fire, orange and alive even in the storm. The human had carved a hollow, lined it with stone, shielded it from the rain, and now flames danced inside like a living heart. Smoke rose and vanished into the storm, and the smell of warmth spread through the cold, wet night. The cadets could not believe it. One cried out that fire was impossible here, that the storm killed every spark. Yet the fire lived, glowing brighter as the human fed it with dry wood he had hidden beneath the logs, planned long before the rain began. The cadets shivered as the warmth touched their imagination, for their own shelters dripped cold water. Their own claws clutched nothing but broken branches, while the human sat by flame, as if he had pulled the sun down from the sky. Envy filled their eyes, and fear grew stronger. They whispered again that humans were dangerous, that they were not what they seemed. The furred cadet muttered that a being who could make fire in this storm could do far worse if given real time. Others agreed, but dared not say more, for deep inside they remembered every story told about humans, stories of persistence, of strange will, of never stopping once a task was chosen. And though they had laughed before, now they wondered if those stories had been truth. The instructors saw the fear. They saw the envy. They saw the human's progress. One of them leaned close and said, "This is no longer a test of shelter. This is a test of spirit. Let them watch him. Let them see what difference truly means." And so they did nothing. They only watched as the storm raged harder, as the cadets fought against rain and mud, as the human built higher and stronger. Hours passed. The storm screamed. Shelters collapsed one after another. Cadets huddled together in broken huts, claws clutching at anything that could block the rain, tails wrapped tight around shivering bodies. Yet still they cast their eyes toward the glow, that steady fire burning against the storm, a beacon in the dark. They hated it. They feared it. But they could not look away. It was hope and warning together, proof that the human was doing what none of them believed possible. The reptilian cadet shouted again through the storm, his voice ragged and desperate. Tomorrow he will fail. Tomorrow the instructors will see he has broken the rules. Tomorrow his strength will leave him. But no one answered, for his words felt hollow, and the sound of the human's hammer striking stone was louder than any lie. Rhythm against chaos, purpose against fear, the sound of something being created where none should exist. And so the night stretched on. The cadets clung to their weak shelters. The storm tore at their pride, their anger, their certainty, while in the center of the trial ground the human worked without rest, building not only walls against the storm, but something deeper, something that the others could not yet name, something that whispered of permanence, of survival beyond one night, something that felt like the beginning of a story larger than themselves. The night deepened, and the storm revealed its true face. The sky turned into a sea of black and silver. Thunder rolled without rest. Lightning tore across the heavens like white claws. The rain became a curtain of water, so thick it was hard to see one's own hand. The cadets screamed and cursed as their shelters began to fall apart. Vines snapped and branches split. Mud walls sagged and collapsed. The forest roared with the voice of the storm, and fear spread like fire through their ranks. One cadet tried to hold up a roof of leaves with both arms, but the weight of the water dragged it down until it crushed him into the mud. Another huddled with two companions beneath a half-finished hut. Yet when the wind struck, the structure lifted into the air and broke into pieces, leaving them exposed and trembling. The reptilian cadet hissed in rage and despair. His vines tangled around him, his claws useless, his shelter nothing but a broken frame leaning sideways. He shouted through the rain that the storm was cursed, that no one could stand against it, that only luck could save them now. But then came a glow through the dark, faint at first, a flicker of orange against the black. The cadets turned their eyes, blinking through rain, and there it was, the human's fire alive, burning steady inside a wall of stone. The flame crackled with defiance, sending smoke into the storm, and every cadet felt a chill colder than the rain, for it was not possible. Not here, not now. Yet the proof burned before them, impossible yet true. Some whispered that the human must have tricked the instructors, that he had hidden fuel or forbidden tools. Others shook their heads, whispering that no trick could stand against the storm, that no secret flame could survive unless it was guarded with great skill. Their envy sharpened into fear, for his fire meant warmth, his fire meant safety, his fire meant survival, while their shelters turned to mud around them. The instructors on the high platform said nothing, their eyes locked on the glow, their records filled with images of cadets crying, cadets failing, cadets breaking, and in the center one lone figure working steady, his face calm in the stormlight, his hands moving with purpose, hammering logs into place, shaping walls, adding stone, feeding flame. The instructors whispered to each other in voices drowned by thunder, but one truth passed between them. The human was not building for one night. He was building for something beyond. The cadets grew restless. Their fear became anger again. Some shouted that it was unfair. Others cried that the fire tempted them like a cruel joke. One furred cadet tried to crawl closer, hoping to steal warmth, but an instructor's drone blocked her path. The rule was clear. Each must stand alone. Each must survive with their own skill. So she turned back sobbing, her body shaking, her eyes still fixed on the glow that promised safety she could not reach. The storm pressed harder. Lightning struck a tall tree at the forest edge. Fire burst for a moment, then died in the rain. The sound shook the cadets to their bones. They huddled closer to whatever scraps of shelter remained, their voices weak, their strength fading. The reptilian cadet hissed again that the human would fail soon, that no one could work through such fury. But his words were hollow, for even as he spoke they could hear the sound of hammer on stone, steady, rhythmic, the sound of work that did not stop. Time crawled like a wounded beast. Every breath felt heavy, every second stretched like a rope about to snap. The cadets prayed for dawn, though the night had barely begun. Their eyes drifted again and again to the glow. It drew them like moths, yet it also crushed them with envy. For each spark of fire reminded them of their own failure, of their weakness, of the truth they did not wish to face, that the one they mocked was the only one who seemed unbroken. Inside his rising walls the human moved with quiet strength, his clothes soaked, his hair heavy with rain, yet his eyes sharp, his body steady, his hands never idle. He fed the fire. He shaped a roof from layered leaves pressed thick and sealed with mud. He set stones to make a hearth. He placed wood in a dry corner. He worked as if guided by memory older than this world, as if storms and nights like these were not new to him, but familiar. Like old enemies he had beaten many times before. The cadets began to murmur, fear mixing with awe. One whispered that humans were strange creatures who refused to stop. Another whispered that they were dangerous because they turned trials into opportunities. Another whispered that if he could build this in one night, what could his kind build in 1 year, in 10 years, in a lifetime? The whisper spread, and though no one said it aloud, every cadet began to understand. They were no longer measuring the test by their own shelters. They were measuring it by his. Thunder rolled again, shaking the ground. Wind howled through the trees. Rain poured like rivers from the sky. Yet the glow remained. The sound of hammering remained. The figure of the human remained, unbroken, unbent, unafraid. And the cadets began to feel a new fear, not of the storm, but of the truth the storm revealed, that humans were not what they thought, not weak, not fragile, not soft, but something else, something harder than stone, something fiercer than flame. One cadet cried out in despair, collapsing into the mud, his shelter gone, his hope gone. The instructors noted his failure. Others soon followed, their shelters broken, their strength drained. They clung together for warmth, whispering prayers to survive until dawn, but still their eyes sought the glow, the only light in the darkness, the only proof that survival was not just possible but certain for one among them. Hours passed. The storm grew even darker. The line between sky and earth vanished. The trial ground became a sea of water and shadow. Yet the human kept building, his homestead rising taller, his fire burning brighter, his silence louder than the cries around him. And slowly the cadets realized that the test had already ended for them, that the instructors were no longer watching their struggle, that all eyes now followed only him. The storm broke bones of wood and walls of mud, but it could not break the human's rhythm. His hammer sang against stone. His fire roared against the rain. His shelter grew into something beyond a hut, beyond a roof. It became a home, and the cadets trembled at the sight, for they understood the meaning. They had been told to build for one night, but he built as if he would live here forever, and that truth was more terrifying than the storm itself. And so the night dragged on, long and merciless, the cadets waiting for dawn like drowning souls waiting for air. But one figure did not wait. He worked, he built, he created, and his fire burned as the storm raged. A symbol, a warning, a promise, that the human was not only surviving, he was claiming the land as his own. The storm had raged through the night, like a living beast, tearing down branches and hurling them through the air, drowning the ground in rivers of mud, striking the sky with endless chains of lightning, and roaring with the voice of endless thunder. The cadets lay in the ruins of their shelters, shivering and broken, their bodies covered in mud, their spirits nearly crushed, their voices little more than whispers drowned beneath the storm. Yet through it all the glow of the human's fire did not vanish. It burned stronger than ever, a beacon that mocked their weakness and gave them fear. When the thunder paused for a breath, and the lightning dimmed for a moment, the cadets saw it. They saw the shape rising from the mud and the rain. It was not a hut like theirs. It was not a crude wall of branches and leaves. It was something greater, something that looked alive. It had walls of logs pressed tight together. It had a roof layered thick with leaves and sealed with mud, so that the water rolled down its sides. It had stone fitted neatly around the base to keep the earth firm. It was not just a shelter, it was a home. Gasps spread through the cadets like cold wind. Some pressed their claws against their eyes, as if the sight itself was too much to bear. Others snarled that it was impossible, that no one could raise such a place in one night. Yet the truth stood before them, rising tall against the fury of the storm, smoke curling from a hole in the roof where the fire breathed, warmth spilling into the wet night like a promise of survival. The human worked still, though slower now, his arms heavy, his shoulders aching, yet his rhythm never broke. He placed stones around the fire to form a hearth. He carved grooves in logs to shape them into tools. He hammered together planks to make a door that swung upon simple hinges carved from vines and bone. The cadets whispered in disbelief, asking each other how he knew these things, how he moved with such skill, how he remembered designs that seemed older than this trial. One said he must have built such homes many times. Another said perhaps his people were born for storms. Perhaps they were born to build. The instructors watched from their high platform, their cold eyes unblinking, their recorders capturing every detail. One muttered that this was no longer a trial but a lesson. Another whispered that history would remember this night. Another said nothing but stared as if seeing something long feared and long expected. They did not stop him. They did not forbid him, for deep inside they wished to see how far he would go, how much one human could do with one night and one storm. The cadets huddled together in broken shelters, their envy thick as smoke. Some growled that it was unfair. Others said the instructors should end the trial now. Others whispered prayers that dawn would come quickly. But none of them could look away from the rising shape, for each new strike of the human's hammer told them the truth they did not wish to face. He was not fighting to survive the night. He was fighting to claim it, to turn it into something that belonged to him. The storm seemed to sense the challenge. It grew harsher. The wind screamed like 1,000 claws. The rain became knives of cold water. Yet the walls of the human's home held firm. The fire roared against the storm, sparks flying but never dying. Inside the structure the flame glowed golden. Shadows danced across the log walls, and even from a distance the cadets felt the promise of warmth, of safety, of life. But they could not enter. The drones circled them, warning that no one may share another's shelter, that each must endure their own fate. So they trembled in the mud and stared at the glow they could not reach. The human paused only once, standing before the fire, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths, his eyes calm though his body ached. He looked at the cadets across the field. He saw their fear. He saw their envy. He saw their despair. Yet he said nothing. He only turned back to his work, placing more wood by the hearth, carving notches into logs, shaping tools from stone. His silence spoke louder than any words. It said he did not build for them. He did not build for praise. He built because building was in his nature, because survival was not enough when creation was possible. The cadets whispered again, their voices thin. They said he was mad. They said he was dangerous. They said he was different. One whispered that humans were not like other species, that they never stopped, never settled for enough, always pushing further, always creating more. Another whispered that if this was what one human could do in one storm, then what could 1,000 humans do in a year? What could they do in a century? The whispers spread like a sickness, filling every mind with fear. The instructors nodded to each other, for they saw the truth written in the cadets' faces. This was the lesson the Academy had not intended, but had now received. This was what it meant to test a human. They had asked for a shelter, but the human gave them a homestead. They had asked for survival, but the human gave them creation. They had asked for one night, but the human built for many nights, for seasons, for generations. And that difference was the reason whispers of humans had spread across the stars. As the storm clawed at the land and the cadets wept in the mud, the human sat inside his home, feeding the fire, listening to the storm like a hunter listening to prey. The walls shook but held. The roof bent but did not break. Water ran off in streams but never entered. He had built not just walls against the storm, but a place where life could endure. And the cadets who once mocked him now watched with hollow eyes, their laughter dead, their scorn turned into silence. Hours crawled by, and the storm began to weaken. The thunder rolled further away. The lightning faded to faint flashes. The rain slowed into heavy drops. The wind lost its teeth. The trial ground lay in ruin. Trees broken, mud deep, shelter scattered in pieces. Cadets huddled like shadows. Yet the human's home still stood, whole and strong, smoke rising steady, fire glowing bright, a monument to his will. And in that moment, as the storm gave its final roar and began to retreat, the truth was revealed, not just to the cadets, not just to the instructors, but to the land itself. The human had not only survived the storm, he had tamed it. He had used its fury as a measure of his strength. He had shown that where others begged for one night of safety, he demanded a lifetime of stability, and he built it with his own hands. The revelation spread in silence. No cadet dared to speak. No instructor dared to deny. All eyes locked on the home that stood unbroken, and all minds whispered the same truth. The human was not like them. The human was something else, something older, something relentless. And from that night onward, none of them would ever forget. The storm faded slowly, yet the night remained heavy with wet silence and broken pride. The cadets sat in ruins of their shelters, their claws dull with mud, their fur pressed flat by rain, their scales shivering from the cold. They stared at the glowing fire that burned steady within the human's walls, its orange light flickering through cracks in the logs, its warmth drifting across the trial ground like a promise none of them could touch. Their envy turned sharp inside their hearts, cutting them worse than the storm had. The reptilian cadet hissed with teeth bared, his tail striking mud in rage. He said the human had cheated, that no one could raise such a place without tricks. He shouted that the instructors should strike it down, yet the drones only hovered with cold red eyes, reminding all that no help would come, no interference. Each cadet must endure alone. The reptilian's words fell into silence, for even his anger could not hide the truth. The home stood strong, stronger than anything the others could. Dream. The furred cadet growled with voice broken from cold. She said the storm would return. She said no roof could hold against the second wave. Her words trembled as much as her body. Yet the others did not answer. They only looked at the walls of the human's home and wondered if she spoke lies to comfort herself. For they saw how the roof, bent yet did not break, how water rolled down its sides, how smoke still rose steady into the night sky. They knew her words were nothing but fear. The human inside did not rest, though the storm had passed. He moved about with slow strength, his arms heavy, but his will unshaken. He added logs to the fire. He carved shapes into wood. He tied vines into new tools, his silence louder than thunder had been. The cadets whispered to each other that he was not simply surviving. He was preparing. He was building not for one dawn, but for many. They did not understand it, yet they feared it, for his vision was beyond theirs, his intent deeper than theirs. He sought not a shelter, but a beginning. The instructors spoke quietly among themselves, their voices sharp yet filled with unease. One said this was no longer a trial. One said this was a revelation. One said the cadets must learn, not only of shelter but of difference. They watched as the human built without pause, his body pushing through exhaustion, his mind steady as stone. They saw his fire glow brighter, his walls grow firmer, his home shift from simple refuge to living place. They saw, and they understood. This trial was already legend. The cadets could not endure the silence of their failure, so their envy twisted deeper. One whispered that they should join together and tear the humans' work down, that if they could not succeed, then neither should he. Others shook their heads in fear, for the drone circled, and the rules were clear. No theft, no sabotage, only survival by one's own hand. And still, even if the rules were broken, who among them could stand against the human now? Who among them could walk through fire and hammer without trembling? Their whispers died like sparks in rain. The storm returned a weaker than before. Rain fell once again, not as knives but as steady waves. The cadets cried out as their broken huts sank deeper into mud. Their vines loosened, their leaves scattered. They clung to each other, trembling, their voices sharp with despair. Yet when the wind howled, they saw again the home still standing, its roof bending but not falling, its fire burning but not dying. They saw the human still working, his hammer striking stone, his hand shaping wood. They knew the second wave belonged to him as much as the first. Anger and fear mingled. One cadet muttered that he was cursed. Another said he was blessed. One whispered that his kind must have secrets older than stars. Another whispered that humans were dangerous because they did not stop where others ended. They did not accept enough. They always wanted more, always built more. The whispers grew and filled every heart, until all the cadets sat with the same thought. They had not come to test themselves. They had come to witness him. Inside his home, the human shaped new spaces. He placed stones to form a dry channel for water, guiding it away from the floor. He built a small raised bed of wood and leaves, lifting it above the mud. He carved notches into logs and placed tools there, neat and ready. He created order within chaos. And the cadets who once laughed now stared in disbelief, their minds breaking under the weight of what they saw. For they had been told to build for one night, yet he built as if for many years. The instructors exchanged glances. They saw the lesson grow clearer. They saw the cadets' fear become knowledge. They saw the truth rise with the walls of the human's home. They understood that this trial had ended long before dawn, that survival was no longer the measure, that creation had replaced it, that the human had shifted the ground beneath them all. They wrote notes in silence, records that would carry this night into history. The cadets felt their pride shatter. They remembered their laughter, their scorn, their cruel words about weakness and fragility. And now those words turned against them, sharp as blades, cutting their hearts. They lowered their heads, unable to meet each other's eyes, unable to meet the eyes of the human, when he stepped outside into the rain for a moment, standing tall in the storm, his figure outlined by firelight, his silence heavy as judgment. The night crept on, hours dragging like chains, the cadets counting each breath, praying for suns to rise, their bodies weak, their shelters gone. Yet the human worked until his home stood strong, until the fire glowed steady, until tools lined his walls, until food roots from the forest were already placed near the hearth. His work spoke louder than words, saying that survival was not enough, that humans did not endure only for a night. They endured to make tomorrow stronger than today. Jealousy clung to the cadets like mud to their skin. They hated him, yet they feared him. They mocked him, yet they admired him. Their thoughts torn in every direction. They knew they could not match him. They knew they could not undo what he had done. They knew the instructors saw only him now. And that truth broke their hearts more than the storm ever could. The challenge deepened not in the storm outside, but in the storm within. The cadets battled against their own envy, their own doubt, their own fear, while the human battled only the land and the night. And he won each battle with steady hands and steady fire. By the time the second wave of rain faded and silence returned, there was no longer any question of who had passed, of who had failed. There was only the image of one home standing tall in ruin, of one fire burning bright in darkness, of one human who had built more than all the others combined. And as the night stretched toward dawn, the cadets realized a truth that chilled them deeper than cold water ever could. The human was not only surviving, he was teaching, without words, without boasting, without seeking praise. He was teaching them all what it meant to endure, what it meant to create, what it meant to be human, and that truth would follow them longer than the storm, longer than the academy, longer than the trial. It would follow them all their lives. The night bled slowly into pale light as the twin suns crept above the horizon, their glow weak at first, hidden by clouds heavy and gray. The trial ground lay broken and drowned, branches scattered like bones across the mud, leaves torn and plastered to the earth, vines shredded into useless threads. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and smoke. The cadets dragged themselves from the ruins of their shelters, their bodies shaking, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, their hearts filled with dread of the judgment that would come with morning. The instructors stood tall on their platform, their black armor dripping with dew, their faces hard and silent. Their drones hovered above the ground, recording every detail. One by one the cadets tried to rise and stand straight, yet their legs gave way. Their shoulders bent under shame. Their shelters were nothing but wreckage, their work erased by the storm. They had nothing to show except failure, nothing to prove except that their doubt had been their undoing. They did not dare to speak. They did not dare to meet the cold eyes of their instructors. Then the eyes of all turned toward the center of the field, where the human stood waiting, his body wet and weary, his clothes torn from labor, yet his figure upright, his gaze steady. Behind him rose the home he had built, tall and strong, its log walls tight and unbroken, its roof heavy yet secure, its fire still burning within, smoke curling upward into the pale morning, the ground around it shaped by careful hands, water guided away by small trenches, food roots laid in storage tools, placed neatly along the walls. It was not a shelter for one night. It was the beginning of a settlement. It was something none had believed possible, yet it stood in the light of dawn. The cadets gasped in silence, their envy twisted into awe, their anger drowned by truth. One whispered that it looked like a place meant for families. Another whispered that it looked older than one night, as if it had always been there. The furred cadet lowered her eyes, shame filling her voice as she muttered that she had laughed at him, that she had called him weak. Yet his work stood, while hers drowned in mud. The reptilian cadet hissed with bitterness, but his words broke in his throat, for even he could not deny what his eyes saw. Even his sharp tongue could not cut through the weight of proof. The instructors descended from their platform, their boots sinking into mud as they walked across the trial ground. The cadets trembled, waiting for judgment, their hearts heavy with fear. The lead instructor raised his arm and spoke with a voice like thunder rolling across empty land. Cadets, you were given a task. You were told to build. You were told to endure, and many of you failed. Your shelters were weak. Your spirits broke. Your pride was shattered. But one among you did not yield. One among you stood against the storm and built not a shelter but a home. The cadets lowered their heads deeper, their bodies heavy with shame, their eyes filled with tears. The human did not move. He stood silent as the instructor walked closer, his gaze sharp as a blade. He circled the human's home. His armored hand brushed against the logs, against the roof, against the stones. He struck the wall once with his fist, and the wall did not break. He touched the roof, and the roof held. He looked inside and saw the fire still alive, the tools neatly placed, the food, roots waiting, and he turned back to the cadets with a voice that cut the air. This was not asked, he said. This was not required. He was told to build a shelter. He built a future. He was told to survive one night. He prepared for many. He was told to prove endurance. He proved creation. His voice echoed across the field, filling every heart with both fear and respect. He lifted his arm toward the human and spoke. This is what it means to be human. This is why their kind is feared. This is why their kind is remembered. For they do not accept survival alone. They shape survival into life. They shape chaos into order. They shape one night into eternity. The cadets looked at the human with new eyes, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, no longer doubting, but filled with a mix of dread and respect. They whispered among themselves that he was not like them, that he was something more, that his silence was heavier than all their words. One muttered that he had worked while they complained. Another muttered that he had created while they had clung to scraps. Another whispered that perhaps the stories of humans were true after all, that perhaps the old legends of fire and persistence were not myths, but warnings. The instructors recorded their thoughts, their eyes heavy, their voices low. They said the lesson had been written. They said the cadets would never forget. They said the galaxy would hear of this trial. They did not smile. They did not praise. Yet their silence carried weight. It was the silence of respect. It was the silence of realization. They had expected survival, but they had been shown creation. They had expected struggle, but they had been shown mastery. They had expected weakness, but they had been shown strength. The human did not speak. He did not raise his head in pride. He only placed another log upon his fire, his hand steady, his movement simple, as if the judgment of instructors and the stares of cadets meant nothing, as if the work itself was the only voice he needed. His silence was not arrogance. His silence was focus. His silence was truth. He had built because that was what he knew, because building was in his nature, because storms were nothing compared to the will to endure. The suns rose higher, their light breaking through the gray clouds, their warmth spreading across the broken ground. The trial had ended, yet the memory of it would not. The cadets knew this would follow them all their lives. They knew they would speak of this night. They knew they would remember the fire that burned when none should, the home that stood when all else fell, the human who built more than was asked, the human who built without rest. They knew they had witnessed something greater than a test. They had witnessed a truth carved into the world with stone and wood and fire. The instructors turned to the cadets and spoke one last command. Remember, they said. Remember what you have seen. Remember the difference. Remember the human. Their voices thundered across the ground, leaving no space for doubt. The cadets bowed their heads, their hearts filled with heavy silence. They would never laugh again at weakness. They would never mock again with scorn, for they had seen what true strength looked like. And it had not roared, it had not boasted, it had only built. And as the suns climbed higher and the storm faded into memory, the trial ground stood as two worlds, one of ruin and mud, where cadets shivered in failure, and one of fire and stone, where humans stood unbroken. And that image was burned into every mind, a lesson that no storm could wash away. The suns rose higher and burned away the last gray shadows of the storm. The air was still heavy with wet earth, the trees bent and broken, the mud deep and clinging. Yet the trial ground was quiet now. The cries of the night had ended. The fear had faded into silence. The cadets stood weak and trembling, their shelters gone, their pride shattered, their hearts filled with shame. All except one, the human who stood before the fire he had kept alive, his home strong behind him, his eyes calm, his body weary but steady. He had endured. He had built. He had conquered the night. The instructors spoke with voices like stone, their words slow and sharp. They told the cadets that survival was not enough, that a shelter of leaves and vines was not enough, that excuses were not enough. They told them that one among them had shown the truth, that one among them had given a lesson greater than the storm, greater than the trial. They raised their arms and pointed toward the human, and said, "This is the meaning of strength. This is the meaning of will. This is the meaning of being human." The cadets whispered among themselves, their voices broken and thin. One said he had seen the human lift logs heavier than any he could dream. Another said she had seen the human light fire when the sky tried to drown every spark. Another said he had seen the human shape walls while the storm ripped the land apart. Their whispers spread, filled with awe, filled with fear, filled with respect, no longer mocking, no longer cruel. Now they spoke with trembling voices. Now they spoke as if the human were more than a cadet, as if he were something older, something greater. The reptilian cadet lowered his head, his tail dragging in mud, his pride gone. He whispered that he had called the human weak, that he had laughed. Yet now he knew weakness had never been in the human. It had been in him. The furred cadet bent her knees and pressed her claws to the earth, muttering that she had dug holes and prayed for escape, while the human had built for life. Others nodded, admitting their shame, admitting their envy, admitting their fear. All eyes turned to the human, and none could deny the truth. The instructors said the trial had revealed more than skill. It had revealed spirit. They said the cadets had been taught that storms test the body, but storms also test the soul. And on this night only one soul had remained unbroken. They said the human had not built because of command. He had built because it was in his nature. And that was what set him apart. That was why humans could never be measured by simple rules, for they did not only follow trials. They changed them. They remade them. They turned tests into legends. The cadets listened, their bodies still weak, their spirits humbled. They felt the truth of the words. They felt the weight of what they had seen. They would never forget the glow of the fire in the storm. They would never forget the sound of hammer on stone. They would never forget the sight of walls rising while their own shelters sank into mud. They would never forget the silence of the human, the silence that spoke louder than their laughter, louder than their doubt, louder than their fear. The instructors ordered the cadets to return. The trial was over, yet as they walked across the mud, their eyes kept drifting back, their gazes fixed on the home that stood tall, smoke curling into the morning sky, logs firm and strong, a fire that still burned though the storm was gone. They knew it would stand long after they left. They knew it would remain as a mark upon the land, a mark that said a human had been here, that a human had built here, and that truth weighed heavy on them. The human did not march in pride. He did not speak. He did not demand praise. He simply stepped from the home, placed his hand once upon the log wall, and walked with the others, leaving behind what he had made. His silence was steady, his eyes forward, his steps calm, as if the building itself was not his triumph, but simply his way, as if creation was no more than breathing to him, natural and endless, as if storms were nothing more than another reason to build stronger. The cadets whispered again as they marched. Some said they would never doubt his kind again. Others said they would warn their people. Others said they would tell stories of this night. The whispers grew and became the first seeds of rumor, rumor that would travel beyond the academy, rumor that would reach ships and cities and worlds, rumor that would carry the truth that humans did not simply survive. Humans built. Humans changed storms into lessons. Humans made homes in one night where others could not make walls. The instructors returned to their halls and recorded the trial, their words heavy with caution. They wrote that the cadets had been given a shelter test, but the human had turned it into a homestead. They wrote that the cadets had been asked to last one night, but the human had prepared for a lifetime. They wrote the humans must never be underestimated, for where others endured storms, humans turned storms into beginnings. Their records would spread through the academy. Their records would reach councils. Their records would be read by those who feared and those who admired, and the story would grow. The cadets carried the memory like a scar. They spoke of it in low voices for years. They told new students of the night when a human built a home. They told them of the fire that burned to rain. They told them of the silence that built louder than words. They told them of the judgment of morning. They told them that they had laughed once, and that laughter had turned into silence, their voices always heavy, their eyes always distant, for they had seen something they could never unsee. The human never spoke of it. He never told his story. He never asked for glory. He simply moved on to the next task, to the next lesson, to the next storm. Yet his silence was not forgotten. His work was not erased. His fire still burned in memory, and the cadets who had mocked him became the carriers of his legend. Unwilling yet unable to let it fade, they became the voices that spread the truth, that warned others, that whispered in shadows. Never underestimate the human. Never doubt the human. Never think the human weak. And so the trial that was meant to be simple became a story told across the academy, across worlds, across years. The story of the night a storm came to break cadets, and one human answered with creation. The story of the night laughter turned to silence. The story of the night envy turned to awe. The story of the night weakness revealed strength, and strength revealed humanity. The story of the shelter assignment that became a homestead. The story that whispered a lesson into every ear that heard it, the lesson of humans. The suns climbed high. The storm was gone, yet the memory of it never left. Not for the cadets, not for the instructors, not for the academy, and not for the galaxy that would one day hear the whispers and tremble, for the truth was simple and heavy. Humans did not only survive, they built, and in their building they changed everything.